Welcome to the Seattle Auxiliary Communications Service Technician License course. My name is Christian, my amateur radio call sign is K7XTN, and I'm one of your instructors. This is Module 1, which will cover an initial introduction to amateur radio, the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, and amateur radio licensing. I'll also briefly go over the structure of the class, the process for getting your amateur or ham radio license, our philosophy about instruction, and a little bit about amateur radio activities. A brief note about who we are. All of your instructors are members of the Seattle Auxiliary Communications Service, or ACS. Seattle ACS is a volunteer organization of licensed amateur radio operators who provide communications support to the city of Seattle during emergencies or times of need. You don't need to be interested in emergency communications and response to take this course, but one of our goals is to improve our community's abilities to respond to disasters and emergencies by increasing the pool of trained, licensed amateur radio operators. The primary goal of this course is to help you obtain your FCC amateur radio license. In order to get your license, you have to pass your technician class exam. We will hold a licensing exam at the end of class on March 15th. The exam is a multiple choice test of 35 items drawn from a total pool of 412 items. To pass, you need to answer 26 of 35 items correctly, or 74%. Our focus in this class is preparing you to pass that exam. In some instances, we will do that by educating you about the scientific, engineering, and/or regulatory reasons and context for why the correct answer is correct and why the incorrect answers are incorrect. But in many cases, the exam questions represent knowledge that's hard to develop until you actually get into the amateur radio hobby and gain experience. For example, look at the question to the right. This is a real exam question that you could get on your technician license exam. It's in the section on practical circuits. The question reads, how can fundamental overload of a non-amateur radio or TV receiver by an amateur signal be reduced or eliminated? They're talking about what you can do if you think your ham radio is causing interference when it transmits to a nearby broadcast TV or commercial radio receiver, something in your house. The correct answer is that you can block the amateur signal with a filter at the antenna input of the affected receiver. Believe it or not, at some point, if you become active in the amateur radio hobby, there's a good chance that you'll develop a lot of knowledge about interference caused by amateur radio transmitters and how to prevent it. But in the short term, that question probably makes no sense. What we're going to do is give you some memory aids and test strategies to help you pass the exam. For example, if you really have no idea what the correct answer is, oftentimes the longest answer is the correct one, because the correct answer typically has to stipulate the details to establish the conditions that make it correct. Test writers tend to spend less time on incorrect answers and often write them shorter. Not always, but often. That is a general test strategy, but in most cases, we'll give you more topic-specific memory aids. It's not that we don't want you to learn this material deeply. It's that we think the best way for you to learn is to receive enough training to allow you to pass the exam, get your license, and participate in the hobby. Then get involved in a club or organization and find part of the hobby that drives your interests and that you can dive into, and then you'll engage in deep learning. After Module 1, which is this introduction you're listening to now, you'll have 8 other modules that cover the topics in the technician license exam. Radio and signal fundamentals about how electromagnetic radio frequency works, electricity, components, and circuits about the building blocks of radio equipment. It explains how it is that we're able to turn electromagnetic waves into a form of communication. Propagation, antennas, and feed lines, which covers how we get those electrical components and circuits to interact with the electromagnetic spectrum. Incidentally, when we're new to amateur radio, we often fixate on the radio transceivers, the actual radios. It's the antenna system that is often the most important in determining how well we can communicate over the radio frequencies. We'll conclude the first day on amateur radio equipment and discuss the types of radios and other communication tools we use in the hobby. On day 2, we'll start with communicating with other hams. We'll talk about radio etiquette and good operating practices. This is essential as the FCC largely has us police ourselves. We'll review licensing regulations. This explains what privileges our licenses confer, what bands we can operate on, and also covers some international laws related to ham radio operation. Operating regulations covers your responsibilities as an operator to meet FCC regulations. For example, how you need to identify your station and how often you need to identify your station while you're transmitting, and what transmissions are legal and which are prohibited. And then we will cover safety. And amateur radio is overall a very safe hobby. However, we work with equipment and are granted privileges to use transmitters that have the potential to harm us and harm others around us. So we'll cover safety fundamentals related to working with electricity, mechanical safety related to towers and antenna installations, and working with radio frequency transmissions, which after all is a form of non-ionizing radiation. Finally, at the end of the second day, on March 15th, we will hold an exam in class. So to begin with, let's talk about what exactly amateur radio is. In regulatory terms, amateur or ham radio is a personal radio service authorized, regulated, and enforced by the United States Federal Communications Commission, or FCC. Other countries also have amateur radio services that are authorized, regulated, and enforced by their equivalent agencies. According to the FCC, the amateur radio service has 4 overarching purposes. First, to advance skills in the technical and communication phases of the radio art. Second, to promote the development of an emergency communication capability to assist communities when needed. Third, to develop a pool of trained radio operators. And fourth, to promote international goodwill by connecting private citizens and countries around the globe. To participate in the amateur radio hobby in the U.S., you need an operator/primary station license from the FCC. Now, a brief aside. You'll note that several expressions in this slide are in blue font. The blue font is to call them to your attention. We're trying to take advantage of something called the familiarity effect. Those specific phrases are part of the correct answers to questions in the portion of the exam covering licensing regulations. One question in the exam pool is, which agency regulates and enforces the rules for the amateur radio service in the United States? The answer is the FCC. Another item is, which of the following is part of the basis and purpose of the amateur radio service? The answer is advancing skills in the technical and communication phases of the radio art. That phrase, radio art, only appears in the correct answer. A brief note about the familiarity effect and why we're going to focus on the correct answer most of the time, and generally will not go through the incorrect answers. The familiarity effect is simply the observation that if you have heard a word, name, or expression before, there's a decent chance that it will sound or appear familiar to you if you hear it again in the future. When studying for multiple choice tests, one of the dangers is studying both the correct and incorrect answers if you do not have the time and interest in studying the subject deeply enough to internalize the underlying logic and reasoning that makes one answer correct and another incorrect, because most likely you'll just remember that you've seen or heard the expression before without remembering if it was correct or incorrect. So for purposes of this class, we generally, though not exclusively, focus on the correct answers to take advantage of the familiarity effect, and we avoid spending time on the incorrect answers, unless there's a simple explanation that is useful and that you can retain. Again, we do want you to ultimately develop deep knowledge about the radio art and understand what makes the correct answers correct and the incorrect answers incorrect. We just expect that you'll learn much, much more by obtaining your license and becoming active in the hobby. So that was the regulatory basis and purpose of amateur radio from the FCC, but it still begs the question, what is amateur radio in practice? Amateur radio is actually multiple things. On one level, it is a set of frequency allocations in the radio spectrum. As you'll learn, the electromagnetic spectrum is vast, and it's used for all kinds of purposes, from your cell phone and home Wi-Fi to GPS to broadcast radio and television stations. It's an incredibly valuable public resource, and some of it's been set aside just for amateur radio operators to use and experiment with. Ham radio is also a community of users who are licensed to transmit and receive communications in that radio spectrum. Ham radio is an evolving set of technologies. The technologies that are used to encode and decode information in radio frequencies to communicate. This includes everything from little handheld radios, walkie-talkies, to very large radio installations with big antennas and everything in between. And finally, amateur radio is a set of formal and informal conventions on how we use those technologies in that radio spectrum which is allocated to us. It's those conventions, etiquette essentially, that allows us to operate with our fellow hams in the U.S. and around the world courteously and effectively. So what do you do with an amateur radio license? Amateur radio operators participate in a huge range of activities. One of our foundational activities is holding something called a net, which is simply a gathering of radio operators on a given frequency in order to exchange information. Sometimes a net is as simple as exchanging names, call signs, and a report on the quality of each other's signals. Some nets are social, where radio operators share stories or news. Sometimes they are formal and for official purposes, as when we hold nets in support of emergency response activities. And a net control operator may take reports from radio operators deployed in the field. We'll give you an opportunity to participate in a social net during the class. Amateur radio operators also engage in friendly contests, trying to make as many contacts as possible over the radio, typically under some set of conditions. One example of a contest that's popular here in the Pacific Northwest is called Summits on the Air, or SOTA. It entails radio operators taking their radios to designated mountain peaks to try to make contacts, which is called activating the peak. They get different numbers of points for activating different peaks. Hams have long communicated with each other around the world, and a prized part of the hobby is attempting to contact radio operators in other countries. This is referred to as DX, which is a shorthand for distance communications. Operators often exchange a kind of postcard called QSL cards. You'll learn more about the meaning of QSL later. These cards memorialize our contacts with remote stations. And our communication is not just limited to voice communications. We also use our radios to transmit digital signals. For example, we have a whole system of email that is exclusive to amateur radio. And finally, close to the hearts of your instructors in this course, ham radio operators are heavily involved in emergency communications and providing communication support in cases where public safety radios, like police and firefighters radios, or commercial communications like cell phones, may not be sufficient. For example, many of us provide radio communications at aid stations or in support of vehicles for foot, bicycle, and water-based races and relays. So what makes ham radio different? There are actually several unlicensed or fee-only licensed personal radio services in the U.S. that are a lot easier to access than amateur radio. There's the Family Radio Service, or FRS, which are the walkie-talkies that you typically find in sporting goods stores or outdoor retailers. These are low-power, handheld radios that transmit and receive on a predefined set of 22 channels. There's a related service called the General Mobile Radio Service, or GMRS, that operates on essentially the same set of channels as FRS, but requires a fee-only license and offers slightly higher power and some greater technical capabilities. And you're likely familiar with the Citizens Band, or CB radios. These are often mobile radios installed in vehicles and are the radios associated with long-haul truckers and popularized in movies like Smokey and the Bandit. More recently, there's a service called the Multiple User Radio Service, or MERS, that's popular among some hikers and campers. All of these are FCC-regulated personal radio services in the United States. They're all relatively low power. They usually operate under 5 watts, none exceed 50 watts, and they all use predefined channels in very, very narrow segments of the radio spectrum. And they all have tight limitations on the types of frequency modulation they use, and I know that doesn't really mean anything to you right now, but it will. And they're also limited in the equipment they can use. And it's usually illegal to transmit using modified equipment that's not commercially manufactured and approved by the FCC for that specific radio service. Now, amateur radio, on the other hand, is given a lot of freedom, and we're generally given a lot of discretion over the equipment, frequency modulation, and power that we use. And we're encouraged to experiment and innovate within our hobby. We're given dedicated portions of the radio spectrum across many bands. And with a few exceptions, we're not required to adhere to channels. We're allowed to use very high power, up to 1500 watts, which for reference is in the realm of the power your microwave uses to heat food. It's a lot of power. We're also allowed to experiment by modifying or making our own equipment, including radios, antennas, and amplifiers. And amateur radio operators have often been in the forefront of developing new radio technologies. Consequently, ham radio is often able to reliably communicate even under some of the worst conceivable conditions when communicating with conventional technologies is impossible. In general, rather than being limited by the specific tools we can use, we're entrusted with adhering to a set of behaviors, like not transmitting out of the bands we're authorized to use and not interfering with other users. We're given some pretty extraordinary privileges in our amateur radio hobby. And with more privileges comes more responsibility. Because of the capabilities of amateur radio, both in terms of power and the variety of ways we are allowed to modulate and transmit radio communications, we have the potential to interfere with many other users of the radio spectrum. And ham radios, in many cases, have unlimited reach, easily reaching outside of the United States into other national jurisdictions and even into space. The reason that ham radio is licensed and requires passing exams to become licensed is because the FCC needs to ensure that operators are qualified to safely, legally, and appropriately operate their radios. Our goal is to help you pass your exam, but it's also to equip you with the essential information to begin operating as a good citizen of our hobby, safely and without interfering with other users. This class is to prepare you to obtain your technician class license. The technician class is the first of 3 classes of amateur radio license currently granted by the FCC. In the past, the amateur radio license classes were slightly different, but these are the 3 the FCC currently grants. The next level after technician is the general class, and the final level is the amateur extra class. The general and the amateur extra licenses grant access to more of the radio spectrum, particularly in the high frequency or HF bands. They give you the ability to become credentialed as a volunteer examiner. These are the hams who proctor the licensing exams. And finally, but not least, by studying to pass the general and amateur extra exams, you can further develop your depth of knowledge in the radio arts. While we're focused in this class on preparing you for the technician class license, you'll have the opportunity to take the general class license exam, and we'll encourage you to give it a try. We'll talk more about that in just a bit. In order to take the exam at the end of our class, you'll need to register in 2 places, one for the FCC and one for the online exam platform that we use. You need to register for an FCC registration number, or FRN, which is what the FCC uses to track individual license holders in the Federal Universal Licensing System. This is the license tracking system that confirms that you have the privileges to operate in the amateur spectrum. You apply for an FRN on the FCC webpage. The link is here, and the FCC issues you one immediately. You'll need your FRN to register for an account on a platform called Exam Tools. We use Exam Tools to administer the amateur radio exams, and it allows us to grade the exams and to submit the results to the FCC much faster than traditional written and mailed exams. The result is that you'll typically receive your license in a few days instead of a couple of weeks. Please make sure that you register in both places before you arrive for class. Between now and the beginning of the class, you can start studying. You will have received a participant information sheet with the email I sent you, where you found the link to this presentation. We use a free online study guide called hambook.org, and we recommend taking practice exams at hamstudy.org. Both of these sites are run by the same group that produces Exam Tools, the platform we use to conduct the exams. In particular, we recommend taking practice exams in what's called study mode. Study mode presents an exam question, gives you the opportunity to try answering it, and then provides the correct answer with a brief explanation about the question and the correct answer. It strikes an excellent balance between educating you and keeping the information bite-sized and focused on passing your exam. Last but not least, as you begin your journey into the amateur radio hobby, you should know what the origin of the term ham radio is. It actually traces its roots back to the heyday of rail travel in the United States, before there was telephone and communication was through Morse code on telegraphs. There was huge demand for skilled telegraphers, and these could be expensive. Railroad superintendents often made do by hiring cheap, unskilled operators. These inefficient railroad telegraphers were ham-fisted and were derisively called hams. This term was carried over into radio when telegraphy made the leap to wireless communications. And like many communities and groups before and since, amateur radio operators appropriated what was originally a pejorative and have turned it into the nickname for our hobby. And that concludes Module 1. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out, and we'll look forward to seeing you in class.